Welcome back. This will be part 2 of my coverage of Chapter 17 on sexual coercion and sexual violence. You'll remember that where we were last time, I had just covered these broad statistics about the risks for college students and people of traditional college age from 18 to 24 of sexual violence. And rather than, I'm not going to review these statistics, but this is where we left off the last time. Now we need to talk about why is sexual assault on college campuses as common as it is. Now, I did pull some of this information from the Department of Health and Human Services Office on Women's Health, but these statistics really are important for all college students, regardless of their sex. Sexual assault on campus is correlated with the fact that alcohol and drugs are present on college campuses, and particularly drinking. In some research, and this is just one example of research finding the connection between access to alcohol and drugs and vulnerability to sexual assault, one study found that 15% of young women reported experiencing an incapacitated rape, which is a technical term referring to being drunk or high under the influence of drugs and alcohol, or drugs or alcohol, to such an extent that the person is incapable of forming consent or controlling anything that's happening to them. So about 15% of young women reported that they had experienced some form of incapacitated rape during their first year of college. And that statistic should be alarming to any of us who think about the college experience. It's also been found that for reporting sexual assault, only 1 in 5 women who and most of this research is questionnaire research, so anonymous survey research. 1 in 5 of the college-age women sampled acknowledged who had stated that they had been sexually assaulted. Only 1 in 5 of them report that information to the police. They may tell other people. They may or may not disclose it to college personnel, but the fact remains only 1 in 5 report having been assaulted to the police. There's also the fact that on college campuses, there's considerable peer pressure, and that pressure is often directed at people who have experienced sexual assault, being encouraged not to report it, not to complain about it, not to indicate who had assaulted them. It's been found in research from a number of different sources that women of college age, whether they are college students or not, so people from that 18 to 24 age range, often are living with people of their own age. So on a college campus, that increases. So you have a high density of people who are same age peers. They're sharing the same environment. They're often not in a heavy contact with people who are older than them, who they consider to be people they would get advice from. So in that kind of environment, people are often responsive to their peers who have more direct influence over them in terms of their social activities. So the peer pressure may come into play in terms of increasing risky behaviors, such as using drugs and alcohol, even when they're underage. They may be drinking, they may be going to parties. They may also be directly pressured into engaging in sexual activities that they would not under other circumstances engage in. Add to that the peer pressure to maintain the status quo on your campus. We have in recent years had numerous cases across the country where people who had been victims of sexual assault have disclosed that their acquaintances, their friends, other people on campus had encouraged them to avoid coming forward, to avoid speaking out. And part of that is a response to knowledge that many individuals who have experienced sexual assault and sexual violence on their campuses and then told, um, pursuing that the people who had attacked them either face criminal charges or specifically that they face consequences on their college campuses. They frequently report that they are retaliated against, and the people who are retaliated against them are other college students. So the peer pressure piece can both have the impact of increasing risky behaviors in terms of the kinds of situations that have been found to be correlated with sexual violence, but also just the social context of college can mean that if you are a person who has survived a sexual assault, you may in fact be exposed to retaliatory activity if you disclose that, disclose the identity of the person who has assaulted you, or if you pursue charges. So those are factors that are all connected to answering the question why sexual assault on college campuses is common. There are other variables, but these are the ones that kind of rise to the surface in the research. Now, for young adults who have experienced sexual violence, we know that people from 18 to 24 they're simultaneously the most likely to be victims, but they're also more likely to not report those offenses to the proper authorities. This information is presented by Rain. If you're looking at people who are in that age range, that 18 to 24 age range, the percentages of people who have experienced sexual violence is pretty high. But then when you ask people why they haven't reported, for those who are students, they often mention that, a small percentage of them mention that they reported it, but not to police. So for college students, that's typically someone in student affairs, or someone who is a part of a committee that is, or not committee, a group on campus that are designated as trained to respond to sexual assault reporting. So they reported to someone, but not to police. Some argue that they believe that the police wouldn't help them. They wouldn't do anything to help. For some, they are concerned that they don't want to get the perpetrator in trouble. In some cases, that's a case where it's an acquaintance, a friend, or it could be an intimate partner who they're concerned that they don't want that person to get into trouble. And that those conflicting sort of responsibilities are often troubling for people who have been victims of sexual violence. For some people, and this should be disturbing to all of us, for some people they report they just didn't believe it was important enough to raise an alarm. I've seen some research that suggests that for college-age people, and particularly for college students, if they have come to believe that certain kinds of behaviors are normative in a college environment, that they don't feel that they can complain about those behaviors. And in some research, it's been shown that, being felt up, being touched, being harassed in the context of a college party, for example, is in some cases seen as normative, despite the fact that the behavior is an example of sexual assault. In the non-college population, if you're looking at non-students, but they're in that 18 to 24 range, about the same level, the same number or percentage of people when they are students are going to report that they believe these things are personal matters, they're private, and they don't want other people to be involved. So about 26% of students say that that's their reason for not reporting. 23% report when they're non-students. Where you see some discrepancies between students and non-students, 19% report of non-students report that they didn't believe it was important enough, whereas only 12% of students. Now, if you look at the top bar on this graphic, the reasons that are listed underneath are the most common reasons, but not having, this largest percentage is other reasons. So that what that tells me as a social scientist is that we need to do more research to understand why it is that young women in particular are not reporting sexual violence to law enforcement. Now, as noted by RAINN and other organizations, and also in other forms of research, part of why you have this other reasons indicated as the largest percentage of respondents who have experienced sexual violence for why they don't go to law enforcement. Coming forward isn't easy. It's been estimated, and this is reported by RAINN, it's been estimated that 7 in 10 cases of sexual assault is someone that the person knows. That inhibits coming forward for a variety of reasons. We often have entangled relationships with our friends and acquaintances. It may be a worker, someone you work with, someone you live near, someone you live with, who is your perpetrator. So in 70% of cases, you're talking about being assaulted by someone you know, someone who's friends with your friends, someone who's acquainted with your acquaintances, someone who goes to your school, is in classes with you. And that inhibits, that interferes with our reasoning when we think about whether or not we should report, because there are obvious concerns about those intersecting relationships. So this makes it infinitely more difficult for people to be open about sexual assault. If you are assaulted by someone who's in your friend group, someone who's in your classes, someone who is well liked by other people, the chances of there being retribution, even if it's not intended retribution, is very high. So people may feel very fearful of rocking the boat of their friend group, even if they've been devastatingly harmed. Now, what the message that RAINN always sends is that regardless of who the person is and what their relationships are to the other people around you, that friend group, even though the reality is, when we look at the data, people often don't want to believe that their friends and acquaintances could be capable of committing sexual assault. They may want to give their friends the benefit of the doubt. The more important belief that they should have in the front of their mind is that no matter who is being accused, the person who has been assaulted deserves to be supported and deserves to be cared for, as opposed to being disbelieved and neglected.
I was 22 when I was raped.
I was 19.
I was 20. I didn't report it for, 1,000 reasons, a million reasons. It was somebody I was involved with. It was a friend of a friend.
My drug dealer.
Met this photographer by myself. I got very drunk. I met some guy in this bar.
He started trying to kiss me, and I said no.
He takes my left leg and raises it on his shoulder.
He went to put his hand in my panties, and I tried to kind of deflect his hand, and that's when he slapped my hand away.
I blacked out.
I was fighting pretty hard at this point, just saying no, please don't, please don't.
I came to, internally I was shaking. I was really trying to look as calm as possible. I could tell that something that I hadn't wanted to happen happened.
He held me down and he forced himself inside me.
I was being pleasant and nice just so I could remain safe and get out of there.
And I kind of just ran out into the street with like my pants on inside out and my shoes off.
And he sat up and he looked at me, and that was, I guess, the scariest moment for me, because I could tell he was deciding whether he was actually going to stop or not, and that was the moment that I realized that I had thought I was in control of a situation that I was not in control of at all.
And I blame myself for putting myself in that situation.
I knew that I had no proof.
I could hear people's judgment saying, well, why did you do that? It was your fault.
I was still in like physical pain from this and sitting there going, oh, well, no one's going to believe me.
It was my word against his.
Everyone was going to go, this girl just, slept with this guy and changed her mind.
I wasn't the perfect victim.
I figured, who's gonna believe some cokehead college girl?
I didn't like try to fight him off, or I didn't slap him around, or, I didn't pick up the phone and call 911.
I didn't know that I was important enough to draw boundaries around what people could and couldn't do with my body. Who wants to come forward with the literal most violating thing that can happen to you, relive it, and then have people telling you that you're making it up?
I thought I would just be better off trying to put this behind me.
I couldn't imagine pressing charges and then having to sit in a courtroom and look at his face over and over.
I thought, well, that's like giving him what he wants. Like, I'm spending more time on him, or spending more energy on this.
I imagine, and I think rightfully so, that it would have been more traumatizing for me in many ways had I reported it. It's up to a survivor to decide what they do with their story. It's up to them if they want to report it or not.
I don't want this to be part of who I am.
I hated myself a lot at the time.
We are violated, we are harassed, we are touched, we are trapped, we're scared. And we just take a chip on the shoulder and we keep our lives going, and that's not fair to us.
And I think it would be wrong to tell them that they don't get to decide what happens next.
So as I said, it's not easy to come forward. I think it's powerful to hear the voices of real people who have had the experience of sexual violence, who can say with clear emotion and honesty why it's difficult to speak up, and how that there are a lot of really rational reasons that are based in the way other people respond and how our culture tends to respond to people who have been who have experienced sexual violence. So I want you to really give that a hard dose of thought as we go forward here.
I was
Now, Rain also lists, because, and here's where we shift in the presentation to some practical things that you can think about. You know, your college students, when we're not quarantined because of COVID, you're surrounded by other people your age. It's helpful to know what to look for. You know, if most people don't come forward, if most people don't press charges when they've been sexually assaulted, it doesn't mean that they haven't been damaged. It doesn't mean that they aren't suffering. It doesn't mean that they don't need help. It may mean that they need support in order to feel confident enough to come forward. It may mean that they need support in order to get the assistance that they need to help them on their road to recovery. So what are some warning signs that the research shows us are, when they're combined together, may suggest that someone you know may have been assaulted? Now, I want to say with this, give you this caveat. These are all signs that someone is in distress. So these are predictors, things that if someone you know and you know reasonably well shows these signs in a cluster, and it's a marked departure from how they used to behave or how you're accustomed to seeing them act, that's a sign that they are in psychological distress. So these warning signs are not exclusive to sexual assault. What they tend to be predictive of is the fact that a person has recently been traumatized, or that they are in psychological distress. So what you should see them as, when you see them collectively, or some majority of these warning signs appear in someone that you know as a significant departure from their usual behavior, that should prompt you to say, my friend is in distress. This person is in distress. It may be helpful if I were to look into and ask this person how they are and what might be going on with them. So first off, when people are in distress, when they have been traumatized, regardless of the type of trauma, depression may be a result. So if you see a person and it is a marked departure for them to show persistent sadness, a loss of energy, a real distinct change in sleep and eating, and pulling out of normal activities, a persistent sense that the person is down. And if that is a departure for that person, it may be a sign that they have experienced trauma. If a person who has not shown a history of self-harm, or even if they have a history of self-harm, they have not been engaging in self-harm behaviors recently, if they start doing so again, if they start to express thoughts of suicide, or are expressing intentions of suicide, that can be a sign that the person has experienced a recent trauma. A dramatic decline in self-image and self-esteem. If the person, discovers that they have an STI, and in your experience of that person, they don't appear to be in high-risk groups for sexually transmitted infections, that can be a sign that they were a victim of sexual violence. If the person is showing concern, again, that's out of line with their usual behavior, if now they are anxious or worried about situations that didn't bother them before. For example, I had a student many years ago who was sexually assaulted. She was raped at a fraternity party. And from that point on, she had a great deal of difficulty being in large groups of people. She had difficulty with noise. She had difficulty with loud music. And there were certain smells that were triggers for her. So those are examples of kind of PTSD-like trauma experiences. So when people who normally would go into certain places, have stopped wanting to do that, stopped wanting to go out, or stopped wanting to congregate with others, that may be a sign that they especially if it's a sudden departure for them, that they have experienced trauma. If you have a person who's, they seem to go off of an academic cliff suddenly, and as a teacher, that's something I pay a great deal of attention to. If I have a student who has been attending class, has been participating, has been on time with assignments, and is engaged, all of a sudden disappears, that's a red flag for any of us who teach. So for a student, if you notice that someone in your atmosphere who used to be, on top of things with classes, on top of things with extracurriculars, is suddenly disengaged and isn't doing their schoolwork, that's a red flag behavior. And finally, there's a fairly significant correlation, especially among young people, that 18 to 24 zone, post-trauma, increased drug and alcohol use is something that is often seen as a warning sign. So as I said, and I want to underscore this, kind of like printed in bold and underlined in your mind, these are signs that someone is in psychological distress. And the way you should interpret them is, if you see in a person's behavior, they have departed from how they behaved in the past, and now they're showing a cluster of some of the things that you see on this list, then it's increased in likelihood that they've experienced something that is psychologically distressing. One of those possibilities is that they've been traumatized, and one of the possibilities there is that they've suffered sexual violence. So again, it's something that can prompt you to have further discussion, to express your concern and your willingness to listen. Now, in addition, we can talk about, and again, this comes from the RAIN website, your young people, when we're on campus, when you're all living in close proximity to one another, you're kind of in and out of each other's lives constantly. And you're aware of kind of what's going on with your friends and acquaintances, intimate relationships. So it's important to kind of keep in your mind a set of heuristics that could indicate to you that your friend or acquaintance may potentially be experiencing intimate partner violence, including the possibility of sexual violence within their intimate relationship. What may happen, and this is like the list I just did on the previous slide, you have to kind of look at this list as a constellation and look at it as, if a person shows these things as a whole, or the majority of the things on the list, and it's a marked change from their usual behavior, then it should prompt you to ask further questions. So if your friend, your acquaintance starts to pull back from other friendships, so outside of their intimate relationship, they're pulling away from other activities, they're pulling away from relationships, so they're not spending as much time with you and your other friends. Maybe they quit sports teams, maybe they drop out of classes that they previously had enjoyed on their own. That can be a concern. In intimate partner violence, what is often a part of the dynamic is that the abusive partner demands that the person that they're with restrict their lives only to them, and shows a lot of guarding behavior and a lot of distrust and control over that person's activities, and that frequently means restricting that person's relationships. If the person starts to say that their partner doesn't want them to do certain things and has been limiting their contact with other people, frequently individuals who are experiencing intimate partner violence, which may include sexual violence, they may state that their partner, when they're invited to go out or they're invited to do things without their partner or with their partner, they may say that their partner isn't interested and therefore they aren't interested. So for example, I had a student tell me that a friend of hers, she really felt that she knew her friend was in trouble when her friend kept using the same statement when they would invite her and her boyfriend to go out on group activities. Her friend would say, "He doesn't enjoy doing that. So we're not going to come." Now, that kind of dynamic where the partner is really exercising control over what you do as a couple is a red flag of intimate partner abuse. If your friend discloses that sexual assault has happened before, so and that may not be in those terms. You know, your friend may say that their boyfriend or girlfriend has pressured them for certain behaviors, has pressured them to have sex even though they didn't want to. They may not classify that as an assault, but if your friend discloses that that's happened, that's on the warning sign list. If someone you know indicates that their boyfriend or girlfriend has exerted some kind of control over contraceptives, and often, you know, I've had students tell me, what do you mean they limit contraceptive options? Is that really a thing? And it definitely is. Abusive people in intimate partner relationships that are abusive, one tactic that's sometimes used is to exert really strong control over contraceptive options, either forcing their partner not to use contraceptives at all, and therefore exposing them to the risk of pregnancy, and not using protected sex options, therefore exposing them to the risk of STIs. And the rationale is that it keeps the partner tethered to them. So having control over contraceptive options means really controlling that person's ability to get out of the relationship with any sort of freedom of movement. If someone mentions that their partner pressures them, whether it's on a regular basis or not, to do things that they don't want to do, and that doesn't just mean sexual activities, it can mean a wide variety of things, such as using drugs and alcohol, going places that they don't feel safe, engaging in activities that they don't want to do. There are lots of examples, you know, forcing people or pressuring people, coercing people to get drunk or high, and then taking advantage of them sexually while they are in an incapacitated state is something that obviously is an indicator of intimate partner violence and sexual violence. Another red flag, and we've talked about this in class earlier in the semester, if a partner appears to be really restricting someone's use of communication, such as demanding passwords, demanding access to their phone, their messages, even holding on to their phone or their computer in order to monitor who they're talking to and what they're talking about, is a sign of an abusive relationship. And then finally, if people show bruises, if they show marks, for example, I had a student several years ago who told me that her roommate had come out of the shower and was wrapped in a towel, and she noticed on her back a wicked red bruisey mark on her shoulder in the shape of a hand. And she asked her friend what had happened, and she gave her an excuse that made no sense, like she had bumped into something. Well, you don't get a handprint bruise on your back by bumping into a wall. That's an obvious sign that someone has struck her. After further conversation, her friend disclosed that her boyfriend the night before had roughed her up, had hit her, had struck her several times, and in fact had raped her. So you have to be kind of aware that these signs of physical assault could be tied to someone's intimate relationship and warrant further conversation. Now, RAIN also lists, since we are in a technological age, a variety of ways that digital technologies can be used to damage people. And that includes engaging in sexually harassing ways toward other people. It can be also be used for gender harassment as well. Cyberbullying is an obvious example here. There's also taking people's images, taking sexual images of someone and distributing them without consent, which is in fact illegal under certain circumstances. Hacking someone's computer or accessing their computer without their consent and stealing their images. Online harassment in social media. And there have been some notorious examples of this in online gaming as well. So there are gaming platforms, and it seems like every other day we experience a new new way of interacting on social media. For example, during this corona lockdown, some Zoom classes in K through 12 were being hijacked by people who decided they should talk about really disgusting sexual things in front of very small children in their meetings. And in other cases, they were hijacking meetings, not K through 12 at this time, but hijacking them to spread gender harassing and sexually harassing information and ideas. In some cases, digital technology is used to post shaming, embarrassing, inappropriate information about someone. One really egregious example from another college campus, not ours, a person had gone to a party, drank a fair amount, and was videotaped in a suggestive dance with another person. The dancing was then, the video was then posted widely on an internal kind of messaging system that students were using with each other. I don't remember which format that was, but it was a widely used social media kind of device that college students were using at the time. And what they did was they posted this fairly unattractive drunken dancing video, but they also indicated that the woman being depicted in the video had slept with every man in the house that night. So she was publicly shamed, she was embarrassed, she left the school. She hadn't had sex with anyone, but there was, in her opinion, no coming back from it. So she was publicly embarrassed and shamed. Sending sexually explicit information through email, whether it's photos or messages, to unsolicited, to people who didn't solicit such messages and didn't want to receive them. I know that on Perusal and in the discussion boards, we've had some conversations about that. If you take pictures or videos of someone without asking and then getting their consent, is something that happens. It's been in my kids' high school, there were a couple of cases where boys were kind of encouraging each other to videotape their sexual interactions with girls in the school, and then they would post them to their Facebook group and share them widely. So that's a criminal act because the people being recorded were underage. It doesn't really matter if the people doing the recording are underage, it's still a felony. Another example is posting or sharing pornographic images. And that's, there's a technical legal definition of what is and is not porn, and the line is kind of fuzzy, but if you're sending through text messages, if you're sending through email, pornographic images to people who don't want them. That is an example of digital sexual harassment. And then finally, using technology as a means of stalking and tracking people. Stalking people, dogging their whereabouts, despite the fact that we may have this perverted notion that if someone who loves you wants to know where you are every second, we might think that's romantic. It's really not. It's actually stalky behavior, and it is a major predictor of escalating violence. So what I'm going to talk about for the remainder of the presentation is what exactly do we mean by consent? And this is one of my favorite explanations.
If you're still struggling with consent, just imagine instead of initiating sex, you're making them a cup of tea. You say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they go, "Oh my God, I would love a cup of tea, thank you." Then you know they want a cup of tea. If you say, "Hey, would you like a cup of tea?" And they're like, I'm not really sure. Then you can make them a cup of tea, or not, but be aware that they might not drink it. And if they don't drink it, then, and this is the important bit, don't make them drink it. Just because you made it doesn't mean you're entitled to watch them drink it. And if they say, "No thank you," then don't make them tea at all. Just don't make them tea. Don't make them drink tea, don't get annoyed at them for not wanting tea, they just don't want tea, okay? They might say, "Yes please, that's kind of you." And then when the tea arrives, they actually don't want the tea at all. Sure, that's kind of annoying as you've gone to all the effort of making the tea, but they remain under no obligation to drink the tea. They did want tea, now they don't. Some people change their mind in the time it takes to boil the kettle, brew the tea, and add the milk. And it's okay for people to change their mind, and you are still not entitled to watch them drink it. And if they're unconscious, don't make them tea. Unconscious people don't want tea, and they can't answer the question, "Do you want tea?" because they're unconscious. Okay, maybe they were conscious when you asked them if they wanted tea, and they said yes, but in the time it took you to boil the kettle or brew the tea and add the milk, they are now unconscious. You should just put the tea down, make sure the unconscious person is safe, and this is the important part again, don't make them drink the tea. They said yes then, sure, but unconscious people don't want tea. If someone said yes to tea, started drinking it, and then passed out before they'd finished it, don't keep on pouring it down their throat. Take the tea away. Make sure they are safe, because unconscious people don't want tea. Trust me on this. If someone said yes to tea around your house last Saturday, that doesn't mean they want you to make them tea all the time. They don't want you to come around to their place unexpectedly and make them tea and force them to drink it, going, "But you wanted tea last week," or to wake up to find you pouring tea down their throat, going, "But you wanted tea last night." If you can understand how completely ludicrous it is to force people to have tea when they don't want tea, and you are able to understand when people don't want tea, then how hard is it to understand when it comes to sex? Whether it's tea or sex, consent is everything. And on that note, I'm going to make myself a cup of tea. If you're still
So with that, and I think that's one of the simplest, although it's a cheerful example, but it's one of the simplest, most straightforward demonstrations of what is and is not consent. In some cases, I think we, in our interpersonal relationships, we overthink the meaning of the word and what it should and should not entail, especially when we're talking about sexual interactions where we are frequently so uncomfortable in saying what we want and what we need and what we don't want. So consent, to define it formally, is an agreement between participants to have sexual activities. And what this doesn't mean is I need a contract signed by you that says you will engage in A, B, and C sexual activities. I know in the 80s there was a series of jokes that even made Saturday Night Live after a university in Ohio set out to have very explicit rules on their campus for social engagement where people had to ask for affirmative consent for every touching interaction. So the joke was you would have to say, "May I hold your hand now, please?" Or "May I kiss you?" And then the person would have to say yes or no in response. But while we're not going that far, still, consent needs to have agreements among participants. If you are not sure that someone has consented, then they haven't consented. So when you're engaging in sexual activities, consent is all about communication and your willingness to communicate effectively. The argument that the folks at RAIN make is it should be woven into the very fabric of your engagement in sexual activities with people, regardless of how long you've been with them. When you know someone extraordinarily well and you read them well and they read you well, there's less conversation that's required. However, even under those circumstances, people change, people grow, people's needs shift. So ongoing communication and an ongoing understanding of consent is required. Giving consent for one thing at one point in time doesn't mean you've consented for it forever. It doesn't mean that you have to affirmatively say no to that behavior. It means that you have the right to either say yes or no to behaviors at any given point in time. If you've had some sex with someone in the past, it doesn't mean that you have consented to have sex in the future. Sometimes this is used as an explanation. You've had sex. It's often used as a justification for saying that a person who has experienced sex, unwanted sexual assault, so they've been forced to have sex within an intimate relationship, that it's not really rape. Because what's argued is that you've had sex with them before, what's the big deal? And isn't it possible that your partner has become confused? That since you've had sex with them in the past, you should be willing to have sex with them again. Well, no. Just because you've had sex with someone previously doesn't give that person permission to force you to have sex in the future. And at any point in a sexual encounter, you become uncomfortable, you have a right to say stop. This is one of the things, when I teach this class and students run into BDSM, they often kind of get caught up in the salacious details of sex toys and whips and chains and floggers. Well, there's one thing that the BDSM community, when you're talking about people who are engaging in very adult, very mindfully considered ethical BDSM interactions, it's all about consent. And there are safe words, there are stop points, there are things that are clear no-go zones, there are things that are maybes, and there are things that are total yeses. Remember back to the first week of class where I talked about those yes, no, maybe lists. People, when they engage in BDSM sex, they have to be all about consent. And if at any point someone is uncomfortable, if they are overwhelmed, they can say the safe word and the game is over. So you can say what you want about the BDSM world, but one thing that they get right is consent. So what is positive consent? And I like this concept. I often call it affirmative consent. Positive consent means that when you are engaging in communications with your partner or with a sexual partner or partners, you are asking questions. You aren't simply engaging in behaviors and hoping that the person will like it. You are asking questions. So communicating when you change what you're doing, when you're moving to a different level of sexual activity, like moving from kissing to having petting, if you forgive my 1970s language, making sure that the person is okay. And this is especially true if you're in a newer relationship where you don't know the person particularly well. But it comes up in mature relationships as well. And it's really nice when your partner says, is this okay? How are you feeling? Shall we continue? Those are positive consent questions to ask. And you should also be reminded, if someone asks you a question, it's more than just having a right to say no. It's kind of a requirement. If you are not comfortable, just because you don't want to hurt someone's feelings or you don't want to make them uncomfortable, if you are uncomfortable, you need to say so. It's a part of really kind of owning the consent process, is not really being that person who says, I'm just going to suffer with this experience because I don't want to hurt my partner's feelings. You need to be responsible to yourself and take positive control of the consent process by saying, if something does feel good or you want to try something, you say yes. If you're not sure, you say, I'm not sure, but I'm open to trying. If it becomes uncomfortable, it's part of your consent responsibility to say, this doesn't feel good. Or even after the fact, I tried it, don't like it, don't want to go there again. Or I tried it, that was really interesting, I'd like to try that again. So consent is a two-way street. It's not just the person who wants to engage in a particular behavior who has to ask the questions. It's also the person who is responding to the questions who has to be honest. Frequently, women feel like, their kind of role in the sexual relationship, if we're talking about heterosexual sexual relationships, women are kind of taught that their role in that sexual encounter is to be careful about their partner feeling satisfied and not really to be concerned or to put their own satisfaction kind of in second place. So we're often socialized as girls and women to feel like we have to protect the feelings of our sexual partners, and therefore kind of saying that we're not comfortable or that something doesn't feel good, we're often resistant to doing that because it may upset our partner. So positive consent is a two-way street. It requires that both all parties ask questions that can be responded to with yeses and nos and maybes. You can also incorporate physical cues. If someone asks you a question, is this okay? And by physically encouraging the behavior, as long as you are confident that your partner has clear information, has a clear knowledge of who you are and what you're like, and can read those cues accurately and won't misconstrue them, then you can use physical cues. Otherwise, words are best. So what isn't consent? And here, when I talk to college students, especially at my age, I'm in my 50s, I'm a person of long experience. I've had so many students in my office tell me about the horrible things that have happened to them in their intimate relationships. I mean, it's not an everyday occurrence, but it's happened enough. Both men and women have told me about their experiences of rape and abuse and incest in their lives. And I've always been astounded by the number of them who talk about how they were, at least in part, responsible for what happened to them. And part of what they were confused about was predicted by this confusion about what consent isn't. So we need to be clear on some of the things that really don't indicate consent. But in our cultural context, and if you really pay attention to media messages, we send a lot of these media messages about some of the things that'll be on this list. I frequently see still, even in 2020, lots of storylines in fiction, lots of storylines on television, in media, where someone is shown saying no, forcefully saying no, but then later being convinced that no isn't really no, and then having sex. And then they're shown really enjoying it. So we have a tendency in our culture to believe, especially for women, that they are to put up a fight as a part of the romance narrative. So what happens there is that for some people, they believe that no isn't really no. No is just an opening statement, and it's an invitation to be persuaded or pressured instead. So if you believe in consent, you have to stop refusing to acknowledge no. And again, consent is a two-way street. If you actually want to engage in sexual interactions, don't say no when you don't really mean it. If you say no, you have to mean no. If you're making assumptions, as wearing certain kinds of clothes or behaving in what might be interpreted as flirtatious, it might be interpreted as flirtatious, or if you're engaging in kissing, if you assume that those are cues that say, I am ready and willing and able to have sex, you are misconstruing those cues. And last year, the last time I taught this class, there was a really interesting, complicated set of conversations that we had in response to a discussion question posed by a member of the class. He was very uncomfortable with his girlfriend wearing what he called very low-cut, suggestive clothing. In fact, the terminology he used was slutty clothing. Now, that alone got him a lot of flack in the class, but he argued that, you know, she was with him. It was really bothering him that she was kind of, quote, putting herself out there for other people. And, you know, the thing that's relevant here is, in his mind, he saw her dressing in what she thought of was just really nice club clothes, dancing clothes. She had her makeup on, her hair was perfect, she had this nice dress on. And for her, it was just party wear. For him, he thought it communicated to other men that she was ready, willing, and able to have sex. So it was a long, complicated conversation. And a lot of the women in the room said, you can't tell women what to wear. We can wear whatever we want. It's your responsibility to control yourself. So what that exposes to me is, as a social scientist, is, you know, we have a cultural narrative that says that if girls and women wear certain clothes, they're, quote, asking for it. So you need to let go of that. If someone kisses you, it doesn't mean you have permission to go farther. If someone is flirty and they're nice to you, it doesn't mean that they want you to touch them up. So those assumptions, clothing is not consent, kissing is not consent for intercourse, or anything else for that matter. If someone's underage you should assume they are incapable of consent. Now, each state has formal legal definitions of underage. If someone is under 18, and I've had lots of questions from, say, 19-year-olds who, they were in high school with their high school sweetheart who happened to be 2 years younger than them, but now they're 19, their girlfriend's 17. Is that going to be considered statutory rape? Probably not, but it really does depend on the state you're in. That issue, the legal issue aside, if you are encountering someone who is too young, who is not an adult, or who is below the legal age of consent, and again, it varies state to state, you should not consider them saying yes to carry the same weight as someone who is above the age of consent. You should consider them hands off. If you are, as the T video indicates, if someone is incapacitated, if they are very drunk, if they are high, if they are unconscious, they cannot consent. It's disturbing that in survey results, asking these questions to college students, a significant proportion of college students, both males and females, indicated that it's okay to have sex with someone who is drunk to the point of unconsciousness. Now, a significantly higher percentage of men say that's okay, but a disturbing percentage of women say that's okay as well, because she shouldn't have put herself in that position. That should bother all of you. If someone is incapacitated, they are incapable of forming consent. It doesn't matter how they got that way. You don't touch them, other than to roll them on their side so they don't puke. Pressuring someone into sexual activity by scaring them or intimidating them is inappropriate. In this age of 50 Shades fandom, it's always been disturbing to me to see media images of the male lead, or in a surprisingly rising percentage of films with female leads, having someone who is very, very physical, very intimidating, very controlling, who is presented to the audience as the romantic lead, who is shown really physically pushing and emotionally pressuring someone into sexual activity, and then that person later being depicted as enjoying it. That's very problematic. It's very common in our media. It's very common in pornography, but it's something that isn't consent. If you have to pressure someone using fear and intimidation, if you have to pressure them using physical coercion, it's not consent. If you assume that you have kind of blanket permission for whatever reason to engage in sexual acts that you haven't engaged with that person prior, you need to ask the question. You can't just assume because you've done one sexual act that you can do another sexual act. You have to, when new territory is being explored, you have to ask new questions of your partner. And you have to respect your partner's answer. If certain things are off limits, they're off limits. You don't have the right to ask for more. So to conclude, I mentioned in part 1 for this chapter that I pulled a lot of my information from the RAIN website, that's Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network, but I've also pulled a lot of information from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, which is an excellent website with tons of useful information on it, and also the CDC sexual violence section. I have included these links on your D2L page for this chapter so that you have easy access to them. That concludes our coverage of Chapter 17.